Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a creation story older than Genesis, and it begins not with light, but with water. Long before a garden, long before dust, long before a voice divided day from night, there were two living depths, Apsu, the sweet water below, and Tiamat, the salt water beyond, and from their mingling came the first pulse of the world. If that sounds like the kind of old secret you came here for, press like, settle in, and stay with me. Lower the light a little. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the room grow still, because this story does not rush. It moves like deep water, slowly, quietly, and with the feeling that something enormous is already awake beneath the surface. If you were standing here with me, near the edge of that first beginning, you would not see mountains, or stars, or even a line between sky and earth. You would see only a dark immensity, a moving sameness, a vast body without shore, without wind, without birds, without the scrape of sandals, without the creak of cartwheels, without even the comfort of a horizon. The ancient Mesopotamian imagination did not begin with emptiness in the way later traditions often prefer. It began with substance, with movement, with a world not yet shaped, but already alive. That is one of the quiet differences that makes the Enuma Elish feel so old and so unsettling. Nothingness would almost be easier. Nothingness is clean. This beginning is not clean at all. It is wet, fertile, breathing, and difficult to separate into parts. The first presence was Apsu, the sweet water deep below, the hidden water, the underground current, the cool reservoir beneath the dust and the reed roots. In a land where heat could lean over a field like a punishment, sweet water was not a small thing. It was survival. It was bread in the future. It was a green line appearing in brown country. It was wells, springs, wet clay, canals, gardens, and a city that could exist because thirst had been answered. So when the old Babylonians imagined the world before the world, they gave one half of it the nature of fresh water, the nourishing, deep, not kind exactly, but necessary, not sentimental, but life-giving. The other presence was Tiamat, the salt water sea, the deep beyond the ordered lands, the great body that could not be fenced, taxed, measured, or trusted. Her name carries the old feeling of the deep itself. Wide, shifting, dangerous, mothering, and merciless when crossed at the wrong hour. If Apsu is the well and the spring, Tiamat is the horizon that does not answer when you stare at it. She is the great water that holds storms in its chest. She is the roll of waves in darkness, the taste of salt on lips, the force that can cradle ships one week and bury them the next. Ancient minds rarely make the sea only beautiful. They know too much. They know what vanishes there. What I have always found so strange and beautiful is that the oldest lines do not present these two as ideas alone. They are persons, living beings, divine presences. They do not symbolize water from a safe intellectual distance. They are water, and because they are water, They are already charged with power before any sun has been hung in the sky. In this story, creation does not begin with a command. It begins with relationship, with the nearness of one depth to another, with mixing, with contact, with the old truth that life often begins where different currents meet. Imagine that meeting for a moment. Not quickly. Slowly, the sweet water of Apsu rising in cool hidden streams. The salt water of Tiamat swelling in the dark above and around. Their edges touching, then folding into one another, not as an explosion, but as a vast, patient stirring. No trumpet, no thunder yet, just a long cosmic blending, like ink moving through clear water, like moonlight spreading over a canal, like two breaths crossing in a room where no one else has arrived. In the deltas of Mesopotamia, where rivers emptied toward the Gulf, people could watch fresh and salt waters meet and understand that this place of mixing was rich, unstable, and generative. Mud gathered there. Silt settled there. Fertility began there. The myth remembers that physical truth and raises it to a cosmic scale. From that union, the first divine generations begin to appear. Not from a workshop, not from a solitary word, from mingling, from bearing, from the slow pressure of one existence against another. The first beings are Lamu and Lahamu, names that feel thick with silt and early earth. Even here you can sense how close theology remained to landscape. These are not airy abstractions. They feel like deposits left behind when waters begin to settle. They are the first suggestion that the world may become structured, that something may rise from fluidity and remain. Then come Anshar and Kishar, the horizons of sky and earth unfolding farther apart, as though the universe were stretching in its sleep. Space begins to organize itself. Realms begin to imply one another. The old waters are still beneath everything, still prior, still deeper, but now there is a sense of expansion, of architecture, beginning in thought before it appears in matter. The family of gods grows, and with each new generation there is more distinction, more definition, more activity. It is a little like watching a city appear from a marsh over centuries. First the mud, then the platform, then the wall, then the gate, then the noise. Order does not arrive all at once. It thickens. And then, eventually, from this divine line comes Anu, and after him comes Ea, the brilliant one, the cunning one, the Lord of wisdom and subterranean waters, known in older Sumerian tradition as Enki. If the earlier generations feel immense and slow, Ea feels awake, restless, clever. There are gods who seem made to continue what already exists, and gods who seem born to alter it. Ea belongs to the second kind. Ancient descriptions give him 4 eyes, 4 ears, a flowing beard alive with water and fish, as though perception itself had become divine flesh. He is not only powerful, he notices things, and that kind of divinity is always more dangerous. By the time Ea appears, the cosmos is no longer quiet. That matters more than it may seem at first. In the beginning, there had been depth and union. dark water, and generative stillness. But the younger gods do not remain still. They assemble. They speak. They move. They invent. They gather in energy and sound. Their life expresses itself in activity. The old order was stable because it was simple. The new order is fertile because it is complicated. Complication makes sound. Sound disturbs sleep. And sleep, in this story, belongs to the old waters. Try to hear that early divine noise the way Apsu would have heard it. Not as lively conversation, not as promising movement, but as interruption. Murmurs rising where there had once been only the slow pulse of water through darkness. Footsteps where there had been drift. Arguments, counsels, experiments, plans. The young gods are not evil. That is not the point. They are new. And newness has a sound that old powers rarely enjoy. You know that feeling when a quiet house changes after children arrive, or after guests stay too long, or after one generation that loved silence finds itself surrounded by another that loves talking late into the night. Nothing terrible has happened, but the whole atmosphere has changed. That is what is happening here, only on a cosmic scale. The younger gods are full of motion because they belong to a universe becoming more than it was. They are not content to drift inside inherited stillness. They hold assemblies. They produce heat, argument, intention. The old Mesopotamian mind understood something very subtle here. Creation is not only beauty, it is disruption. Every new arrangement disturbs an older balance. Every fresh intelligence creates friction. The universe does not move from nothing to something without irritation. It grows noisy. For a while, Tiamat bears this. That is important. The great saltwater mother is not yet the terrifying enemy she will later become. At first, she remains broad enough to contain these younger presences. Her nature is wide, and chaos, in its earliest form, is not always hostile. It can be generous. It can allow. It can hold contradictory things without choosing between them. Apsu, though, is another matter. He is not built for this endless agitation. His realm is depth, source, continuity, the old life beneath the world. He feels the younger gods not as fulfillment, but as abrasion. Their vitality scratches across his ancient calm. Honestly, this is where the story begins to feel almost painfully human. The old resenting the young. The stable resenting the experimental. The one who made conditions possible, now watching others fill those conditions with movement he did not ask for. Apsu does not hate life in the abstract. He hates what life has become around him. He is the elder who can no longer sleep because the next generation has turned inheritance into innovation. He is the force of continuity, becoming exhausted by the very complexity his own existence allowed to arise. As the younger gods continue their assemblies and their bustling presence, Apsu begins to bloat. The deep, cool pressure of sweet water begins to feel less like nourishment and more like suppression, like something gathering itself. Springs and hidden channels belong to him. What happens when the keeper of buried waters grows angry? The old audience would not have needed that explained. They knew what flooding was. They knew canals could fail, that the source of life could become the agent of ruin in a season. And still, even with that tension rising, the opening of Enuma Elish does not hurry. It lingers in generational movement, in the feeling that a cosmos is being born not through instant perfection but through strain. A later tradition may give you order by decree. This older one gives you order by pressure. Water against water. Parents and offspring. Stillness against movement. Silence against noise. Preservation against emergence. The listener who stays here long enough begins to understand the dark promise hidden inside the first lines. Before Genesis spoke of light, this story already knew that creation had a cost. It knew that even divine family could turn tense. It knew that the waters from which life rises are also the waters that can drown it. It knew that every ordered thing floats over a depth older than itself. And that depth does not always enjoy being disturbed. Now imagine the great primordial pair once more. Apsu below, cool and hidden. Tiamat, vast and salt-laden. Between them, the younger gods multiplying, brightening, moving, speaking, and planning the kinds of things gods plan when the cosmos is still soft at the edges. And somewhere in that gathering noise, a threshold is crossed. Not suddenly. With weariness. With the old patience finally thinning. Apsu listens. And the sound that once might have seemed like life now sounds to him like violation. The deep that fed the world begins to dream of silencing it. So the first movement of this ancient creation story leaves us not in peace, but in suspension. The family of the cosmos has been born. The waters have mingled. The divine generations have taken their places, and the universe has begun to breathe with complexity. But underneath all of it lies a problem so old it still feels familiar. The powers that begin a world do not always welcome what that world becomes. And in the darkness, below the growing order, Apsu is no longer merely listening. He is deciding. In the hush beneath the new divine commotion, Apsu reaches the thought he can no longer keep from hardening. The younger gods will not settle. They will not soften their voices, or return to the older rhythm, or show the sort of reverence that old powers hope time alone will produce. They move too much. They think too loudly. They fill the growing cosmos with the sound of becoming. So he decides that the only way to restore the first stillness is to remove them entirely. That turn is as cold as deep water before dawn. What makes it even darker is that Apsu does not seem to understand himself as cruel. From his perspective, he is preserving the proper condition of existence. The first order, the old order, the quiet order, existed before these younger beings brought heat and friction into it. He is not choosing chaos. He thinks he is preventing it. Ancient myth can be brutally honest about this. The destroyer is often the one who believes he is rescuing the world from change. If you slow the scene down, it becomes almost uncomfortably familiar. A parent tired of the children. A founder repelled by what his inheritance has grown into. An old system so strained by novelty that it mistakes extinction for correction. Apsu is not merely angry. He is weary in a cosmic way. The deep springs beneath reality want their old sleep back. He does not shout his intention into open assembly. He plots. Even among gods, violence begins by going private. In hidden council, the old freshwater power turns his thoughts toward elimination. The younger gods, noisy as they are, still trust that the world will keep making room for them. They do not yet understand that one of the first beings in existence has begun imagining a universe from which they have been cut away. Tiamat does not fully join him. Not yet. She is still too wide for that kind of immediate narrowing. The sea can hold contradiction longer than a spring can. She has felt the younger gods as disturbance. Yes, but not yet as a presence that must be erased. In this early hesitation, there is something almost grand about her. She remains the older matrix, the one who can still contain opposite futures. That is part of what makes her later transformation so heavy. She does not begin as an eager destroyer. She begins as someone vast enough not to decide at once. Apsu, though, has crossed his line. And among the younger gods, the one most likely to sense it is He is not the tallest. He is not the most ceremonially remote. His power is different. It moves through awareness, through hidden reading, through intelligence sharp enough to enter a room before his body does. Old descriptions give him many eyes and ears because that is what he feels like in the story. A god who hears what is not meant to be heard. A god who sees motive before it becomes action. So the plot does not stay hidden from him. The text does not linger over every step of discovery, and that feels right. Some knowledges arrive as if through a crack in the world itself. However it happens, the result is clear. Ea understands that the first generations of divine life are now balanced over a pit. If Apsu acts first, the future may close before it has begun to unfold. This is where the creation story grows teeth. Until now, it has been waters, births, and the slow tension between silence and movement. Now intelligence must answer threat. But Ea does not answer with a larger body or a more ancient title. He answers with cunning, with magical knowledge, with the force of speech precisely used. That is one of the greatest shifts in the whole story. Primordial power is confronted not by raw resistance, but by technique. Mesopotamian thought took words with extraordinary seriousness. Charged words. Sacred utterance. Incantatio. A properly spoken formula did not merely describe reality. It pressed upon it, reordered it, bound it, released it, opened it, sealed it. When Ea prepares his response to Apsu, he is not reaching for a decorative religious tool. He is reaching for one of the deepest operative powers the old world knew. Language that acts. Imagine him in the cool half-light of his own region. Water moving quietly through channels no human foot could ever follow. The smell of wet clay. The faint mineral taste of hidden springs. A stillness far more focused than Apsu's weary silence. Ea gathers himself there, not with panic, but with exactness. He is working, selecting, setting one force against another with the care of a master builder laying weight into an arch. He composes the spell. I have always found this moment strangely beautiful. The first great defense of the emerging world is not an army and not a wall. It is thought sharpened into sound. It is intelligence entering the bloodstream of reality and altering its rhythm from within. The old deep that nourished everything is about to be overcome by a sun who understands structure better than the source itself understands its own anger. When the incantation is spoken, the universe does not explode. The magic is subtler than that, and therefore more chilling. The hidden waters listen to their ancient lord, and then, through the force of wiser speech, turn against his intention. Apsu is overtaken by enchanted sleep. He is rendered inert, subdued before the destruction he imagined can be carried out. The one who would have silenced the younger gods is himself silenced. It is a victory, but it is not an innocent one. The old order has been overruled. The son has acted against the ancestor. However justified the action may be, there is no pretending that something clean has happened. Primordial authority has been violated. The line of reverence has been cut. The future survives because intelligence was willing to master origin itself. That is a severe insight. It says that preservation of life may require rebellion against what first gave life shape. It says beginnings do not always remain fit to govern what comes after them. It says age alone does not guarantee legitimacy. These are theological ideas, but also political ones, and the ancient audience would have felt both. After the enchantment takes hold, Ea does something symbolically perfect. He establishes his dwelling above the defeated deep. He does not flee it. He builds over it. He makes the subdued old power into a foundation. Slow that image down and it becomes magnificent. Below, Apsu, the sweet water source, old, silent, bound in enchanted stillness. Above, Ea, bright with skill and perception, raising his own ordered place over the very thing he has neutralized. The new world literally stands on mastered antiquity. There is something profoundly Mesopotamian about that, because their own cities so often rose layer upon layer over older structures, older shrines, older walls, older floors buried just beneath the living ground. The myth understands history like archaeology before archaeology existed. Ea does not erase the deep. He occupies it. The old water remains necessary. Fresh water is still life. The source cannot be abolished without abolishing the world that depends on it. So the story gives us not annihilation, but subordination. What was primary becomes underlying. What was sovereign becomes infrastructural. The sun creates his future by standing on the old power without letting it rule him any longer. It is from this transformed place, this palace above the bound deep, that a greater future will later emerge. But before that future can rise, the cosmos must absorb the consequences of what has just occurred. Because Apsu is gone from active power, and Tiamat remains. Her response begins slowly. That is what makes it feel inevitable instead of theatrical. She is not merely a widow in grief. She is primordial matter, wounded. The one with whom she mingled at the dawn of existence has been put down by descendants who now live in rooms built over his silence. Her sorrow is not domestic. It is geological, oceanic, cosmic. At first she does not roar. She deepens. The sea in old stories often changes before it strikes. A darkening surface, a pressure in the air, a heaviness in the light, the sudden feeling that a horizon is no longer passive. Tiamat begins to feel like that. The broad maternal force that could once contain noise without choosing an answer now starts to incline toward one. The cosmos senses this before it sees the full result. The waters are not simply there anymore. They are gathering intent. This is one of the reasons the Enuma Elish feels wiser than many cleaner creation accounts. It understands that the defeat of one danger can summon another. There is no cheap peace after Ea's triumph. He has saved the younger gods. Yes, he has also broken the oldest arrangement in the universe. That break cannot remain morally neutral. It sends out pressure, like a stone dropped into black water. And Tiamat is more terrifying because she is not foreign to creation. She was there first. That gives her a kind of claim more unnerving than simple opposition. When she turns against the younger gods, creation itself seems to be reconsidering its loyalties. If you were standing by her waters, you might notice the shift in small things first. A bitterness at the edge of the spray. A pulse in the tide that feels more deliberate than before. The sound of waves against invisible boundaries growing heavier, as if the sea has started breathing through grief. There is no army yet, not in formed ranks. No monstrous host. No open declaration of war. But the emotional climate has changed, and in myth that is never a minor detail. Emotion at the level of primordial being becomes weather, current, vibration, catastrophe preparing its posture. Meanwhile, the younger gods are alive because of Ea's intervention, but they are not yet wise enough to understand the full scale of the danger that has replaced the first one. Immediate survival can make people think they are safe when they have only changed the form of the threat. The younger gods have escaped elimination from below. Now they are drifting toward vengeance from the sea. Ea himself, brilliant though he is, must know this at some level. Wisdom that can outmaneuver an elder god is also wisdom enough to feel the cost of success. He has acted rightly by the logic of the story. Yet right action does not prevent consequence. It only shapes what kind of consequence comes next. In that sense, the old myth is extraordinarily mature. It does not confuse victory with resolution. The deep remains under his house. The sea remains beyond his reach. And somewhere in the widening dark, grief is learning how to make war. The world is not broken yet. The great battle has not begun. No monstrous army has risen. No tablets of destiny have changed hands. But the moral weather has shifted. The cosmos has tasted parricide. Intelligence has overthrown origin. And the surviving mother of the first world is turning slowly toward revenge. What comes next will not be a family argument. It will be war on the scale of creation itself. Tiamat does not turn all at once. That would make her smaller than she is. Quick anger belongs to lesser beings, to kings who slap a table, to soldiers who mistake noise for resolve. Tiamat is older than sky, older than brick, older than incense smoke curling up from the first temple court. When she moves toward vengeance, she moves the way a sea changes before a storm fully declares itself. First the pressure shifts. Then the surface darkens. Then creatures below the visible water begin swimming in new directions. By the time the horizon finally breaks open, the transformation has been underway for longer than anyone guessed. If you were standing near that ancient edge with me, you would not hear a scream first. You would hear a strange quiet, the kind that comes before weather, the kind that makes birds disappear from reeds and makes the skin of water look less like reflection and more like metal. Grief does that in old stories. It does not always collapse into tears. Sometimes it gathers tools. The death of Apsu has not passed from the universe just because Ea built his bright house over the subdued deep. The younger gods go on talking, moving, planning, radiating all the restless confidence of those who have survived the first great danger. Yet somewhere under that confidence lies the fact they do not control. They have killed one of the first principles of existence, and the other has not accepted the verdict. Tiamat remains, and remaining is sometimes more dangerous than striking too soon. Ancient Mesopotamian thought understood the sea as a place where shapes are waiting. That is one reason Tiamat's revenge becomes so memorable. She does not merely decide to attack. She begins to generate. Her old maternal force remains intact, but it has changed direction. The same abyss that once gave rise to the divine line now gives rise to war. Creation and destruction turn out to be alarmingly close relatives. The power to make life and the power to unmake order come from the same depth. The old lines preserve this transformation with terrible dignity. Tiamat takes counsel with herself, with those loyal to her, with the ache of being left behind by the very future she made possible. And then, out of that ache, she begins creating beings fit not for song or fertility or kingship, but for terror. Serpents, dragons, horned monsters, scorpion men, storm beasts, fishmen, hounds of chaos, creatures whose very forms seem assembled from the anxieties of every settled people who ever looked into the wilderness and understood how thin the wall around the city really was. Let the pace slow here, because the army of Tiamat is not just a list. It is a gallery of fear. Each being she creates feels like one aspect of disorder made visible. A serpent with venom instead of law. A dragon with jaws large enough to swallow the boundaries that separate one realm from another. A scorpion man with the body of a threshold nightmare, half familiar, half impossible, standing where human life ends and divine hostility begins. Mesopotamian art loved composite creatures because composite creatures tell the truth about fear. Real fear is never one thing. It is always several things joined together. Speed, poison, claws, hunger, darkness, seize, and the refusal to obey categories. I imagine those beings rising not in a sudden parade, but one by one from the dark sheen of Tiamat's waters. One first, then another, then a third shape behind it, not fully visible yet, only suggested by a line of scales or a horn catching faint celestial light. The younger gods, if they see them forming, would understand something chilling at once. This is not a rebellion built from stolen resources. It is a counter-creation. Tiamat is answering the new order with a world of her own. And worlds require leadership. This is where Kingu steps forward, or is raised forward, which may be closer to the truth. In some old stories, the most frightening person is not the oldest or strongest, but the one suddenly given legitimacy over violence already waiting to be used. Kingu becomes that figure. Tiamat elevates him above the others and places into his hands the tablets of destiny. The tablets are authorization, the right to decree, the legal weight of the cosmos gathered into portable form. If you were standing in that scene, you would feel the air tighten. Tiamat can make monsters, yes, but when she gives the tablets to Kingu, the danger becomes political, almost bureaucratic in the most terrifying cosmic sense. Chaos is no longer just a surge of wounded emotion. It is now trying to wear the robes of lawful command. That is much worse. A wild storm may pass. A storm-granted jurisdiction is harder to survive. The younger gods begin to understand this. Panic enters the divine family, not as shrieking confusion, but as the awful knowledge that the conflict has climbed above private grievance. Tiamat has not simply armed herself. She has formed an administration of vengeance. She has made officers out of monsters, a general out of grievance, and a rival center of authority out of the sea itself. The future of creation is no longer secure because the old deep has started competing not only in force, but in legitimacy. That word matters. Legitimacy. The younger gods may be clever, vibrant, and increasingly organized, but the oldest layers of the universe are not entirely on their side. They emerged from Tiamat. They disturbed Apsu. He acted first, and perhaps rightly, but rights within a divine family are never clean. Tiamat can still claim antiquity. She can still claim motherhood. She can still claim that the present order sits on a murder and calls it necessity. Once the tablets are in Kingu's hands, that claim begins to harden into an alternative government of reality. No wonder the divine assembly trembles. What follows is one of my favorite kinds of ancient scene, a gathering of powerful beings who suddenly discover that their power is not the same thing as courage. The younger gods assemble, but no one rushes joyfully toward battle. This is not a tale where the heroic answer appears because the plot needs one. Fear is allowed to breathe. One god speaks, another withdraws. One assesses the danger, another hesitates. The hall of divinity becomes, for a while, an anxious court. They are magnificent, yes. They are also alarmed. Anu himself is sent at one point in some versions to confront the danger, and even he does not secure the outcome. That is a subtle but devastating detail. The senior figures of the new order, luminous, articulate, already clothed in prestige, are not equal to what Tiamat has become. The younger cosmos has energy, but not yet enough concentrated force. It has administration, but not yet a weapon strong enough to defeat the Mother Sea once she turns creative power toward annihilation. This is how a crisis prepares the entrance of a champion. Not by making everyone around him foolish, but by making them honest. They cannot do this. They know it. So the story waits. The hall waits. The frightened order of the young gods waits for the one figure who will not merely oppose Tiamat, but answer her on the same scale. That figure is Marduk. His arrival changes the emotional weather at once. Even before he speaks, he feels different from those around him. Newer in some ways, yet somehow more complete. The poem dwells on his body for a reason. 4 eyes, 4 ears, flames in the mouth, a brilliance that seems almost architectural. He is not just another god stepping out of line. He is concentration. The younger gods are many voices. Marduk is gathered voice. The younger gods are dispersed motion. Marduk is motion focused into direction. If you were standing at the back of that divine hall, watching him enter, I think you would feel, first, not relief, but pressure. Some beings are comforting because they feel kind. Marduk is not comforting in that way. He is reassuring because he feels capable of becoming terrible in a more disciplined way than Tiamat. He is the answer to chaos not because he is gentle, but because he is exact. The assembly tests him, or rather tests itself through him. They set him small demonstrations of power, things that allow the hall to see whether he can command reality rather than merely inhabit it. He does not disappoint. Word, wint, and force align in him effortlessly. Where other gods discuss, Marduk alters. Where other gods hesitate, Marduk specifies. He feels like a king before kingship exists in human form. That is no accident. Later, Babylon needed him to feel that way, but the myth itself also needs it. To defeat primordial chaos, one requires not only strength, but the appearance of inevitable rule. Still, Marduk is not naive. He does not say yes immediately out of noble impulse. He bargains. This detail is one of the sharpest in the whole story, and one of the most politically honest. He will face Tiamat, but only if supreme authority is granted to him once he wins. If he is to risk himself for the cosmos will be reordered around him. That is not selfishness in the shallow sense. It is constitutional thinking. He understands that a victory of this scale cannot simply restore the old arrangement. If he succeeds where others failed, then power itself must be redrawn. So the hall makes its choice. Fear and ambition, necessity and admiration, all converge in a single act. They elevate him. They promise him kingship among the gods. They agree that his word will become fixed, that what he says shall stand. Imagine the ceremony of that consent. Torches guttering slightly in divine wind. Garments heavy with old light. Faces turned toward the one being in the room who has started to feel less like a participant and more like an axis. One by one, the younger gods accept what crisis has forced them to admit. Order, if it survives, will not survive in its old form. There is something deeply soothing in the logic of that, even while the stakes are dreadful. Ancient myths often calm us, not because they are kind, but because they are structured. This one says, yes, cow rise. Yes, the old sea arms itself. Yes, monsters gather. Yes, even the first responses fail. But the answer, when it comes, will come completely. Marduk does not enter halfway. He enters as total reply. Before battle, he arms himself. The scene deserves to be savored. The bow is made ready. The net is spread. The winds are gathered. Not one or two, but a whole tactical weather system held in obedience. He fashions storm as a weapon, not merely something to ride through. Dust, blast, pressure, and movement become extensions of will. The younger gods, who had seemed so noisy at the start of the story, now fall into a different kind of silence. The silence before war. The silence that knows the future of heaven and earth is being tied into straps and lifted into the hands of one being. Picture the room where these preparations unfold. Metal, leather, reed shafts, the smell of oil on polished surfaces, the faint whine of wind already turning restlessly as if eager to be released. Marduk's fingers on the bowstring. His eyes, too many and too aware, taking the measure of the task before him. Outside, if outside still means anything at this scale, the waters of Tiamat move under their own grim confidence. Kingu holds the tablets. The monster host waits. The old universe and the new have both finished gathering themselves. And that is where this movement comes to rest, not with the clash itself, but with the certainty that it can no longer be avoided. Tiamat has transformed grief into an army. Kingu has been clothed in borrowed fate. The younger gods have admitted their insufficiency. Marduk has taken the price of supreme rule and accepted the burden that comes with it. The cosmos stands on the lip of its own decisive violence. All that remains is the meeting of sea and storm, mother and challenger, deep antiquity and the force that would carve the world from her body. The battle does not begin with shouting. It begins with approach. That is one of the details I find most mesmerizing in the old creation story. Before the net, before the arrow, before the splitting of the world into heaven and earth, there is movement through vastness. Marduk advancing, Tiamat rising to meet him. Between them, the tension of everything that has already happened. Apsu's death, Ea's cunning, the monster army, Kingu with the tablets of destiny, the younger gods suspended between hope and collapse. You can feel the universe holding its breath. If you were standing anywhere near that impossible field, you would not really be standing on ground at all. There is no proper battlefield because the world has not yet been built. The combat happens in a realm where sea, storm, darkness, and divine force mix without the neat boundaries later creation will impose. That gives the scene its strange beauty. It is war before geography, power before landscape, the final argument out of which all future maps will be made. Tiamat comes first into full sight. Up until now she has been changing, gathering, creating, appointing, but battle requires appearance. And when she appears, the poem wants us to understand scale. Not just bodily size, though that matters. Scale of presence, scale of terror, scale of antiquity. She is not a dragon in the small fairy tale sense, not a reptile enlarged for spectacle. She is the sea made sentient and offended. Her body is all the ancient fears of unbounded water brought into one moving outline. mouth like a storm opening, belly full of old currents, eyes with the patience of tides that have watched generations rise and fail. To face her is to face the fact that before order there was depth, and depth has never agreed to stay silent forever. Marduk does not recoil. That too matters. Courage in these old epics is often less about emotion than about orientation. He remains aligned. He sees the scale of her and still moves in measure, still carries plan into terror. The winds that serve him are already beginning their work, gathering around his chariot, pressing against the edges of Tiamat's force, making her environment less fully her own. That is how disciplined power confronts ancient chaos. Not with panic, but with encirclement. The net goes first. I have always loved that image, because it is so different from a mere heroic strike. A sword or spear would suggest direct contest, strength against strength. A net suggests strategy, geometry, entrapment, the understanding that some powers cannot be overpowered in a simple line. They must be limited, forced into shape, held against their own expansiveness. Marduk does not try to outsee the sea. He confines it. Then come the winds. Not decorative breezes, tactical weather. He stations them, drives them, directs them into Tiamat's open mouth so that her body swells against itself. It is such a strange and clever image. Chaos is not defeated by the opposite of chaos, but by a superior management of force. Marduk weaponizes atmosphere. He turns motion into control. Tiamat, who had seemed limitless, suddenly finds her own body made vulnerable by the very element she thought she commanded. If you slow the scene enough, it becomes almost intimate. Wind pushing where breath should be, pressure building inside what had seemed invulnerable. The Sea Mother, who generated monsters and armed a rival cosmos, now caught in a net and forced to receive storm against her will. There is no gore required to make this terrible. The terror is in the shift from vastness to exposure. That which had filled everything can suddenly be acted upon. Then the arrow. Old epics know how to make a single weapon feel ceremonial. Marduk does not release a random shot in battle fever. He releases a verdict. The arrow enters at the exact moment when Tiamat has been made vulnerable enough to receive it. It strikes not just flesh, but authority. Not just the body of the primordial sea, but her claim to remain the undivided source. When it lands, something older than victory happens. The possibility that the world can be structured more powerfully than chaos is finally proven. The younger gods, if they are watching from whatever distance divine beings keep from such events, would know at once that the future has changed. Up to that instant, creation had still been reversible. If Tiamat won, the younger order could be erased, or reabsorbed, or drowned back into the old waters. Once the arrow takes effect, the future stops being reversible. The cosmos has chosen a direction. Kingu is defeated as well, though more quietly in emotional terms. That is interesting. He mattered enormously because he held the tablets of destiny. Yet once Marduk has overcome Tiamat, Kingu already feels reduced, almost like the brief legitimacy of a usurper dissolving the moment a greater architecture of power asserts itself. The tablets are reclaimed. Fate itself is taken back from chaos's appointed steward and placed into the hands of the god who has earned supremacy through action. And then comes the most astonishing movement of all, the one that makes Enuma Elish feel older and stranger than later creation stories shaped by command alone. Marduk does not create the world out of nothing. He makes it from the body of what he has defeated. That is not just a plot detail. It is the central philosophy of the poem. Order is not born from absence. It is carved from conflict. Structure is made from the remains of chaos. The world is not separate from the deep it overcame. It is fashioned out of it. He splits Tiamat, not in the sense of careless destruction, but with the deliberation of an architect opening material. One half becomes the heavens, stretched above. The other becomes the earth below. Instantly, the battle acquires a strange peace. The body that had filled the primordial field as threat is now becoming space itself. What had once moved as opposition becomes framework. This is one of the most haunting ideas in ancient myth. The enemy is not discarded. The enemy becomes the house. Try to picture that slowly. The upper vault widening from her divided form. Not bright yet in the way. Later skies will be bright, but established. A roof where there had only been moving depth. Beneath it, the lower world taking weight. Boundary, support. Rivers will later run there. Cities will later press brick onto brick there. Shepherds will later sleep, and kings will later boast, and scribes will later kneel with stylus and clay there. All of that future domestic life will rest on the split body of Tiamat. There is something almost tender in the way the poem lingers over this work. Marduk is still a warrior, yes, but he has become more than a destroyer. He becomes a measurer, a divide, a planner. He fixe station. He marks limits. He arranges celestial pathways. He gives room to stars, to moon, to sun, to the rhythms by which later people will count time, sow fields, watch seasons, and interpret omens. This is why his kingship matters. Not because he won, but because he knows how to administer what victory made possible. The old Mesopotamian imagination loved administration. It loved sequence, boundary, recorded allotment, assigned office, established route. The cosmos Marduk makes is Babylonian in that profound sense. It is a governed world, not soft, not innocent, but arranged. Stars have tracks. Waters have limits. Days can be marked. Festivals can later be timed because heaven itself has been set in order. The very possibility of ritual depends on this act. Once celestial bodies have fixed courses, humans can begin living in conversation with time rather than merely enduring undifferentiated vastness. That is why the making of the cosmos from Tiamat's body is not simply macabre. It is civilizational. It explains why the world is inhabitable. The sea, defeated in battle, becomes the conditions under which counting, agriculture, kingship, law, and worship can eventually exist. The older myth is brutally honest, but also deeply practical. It says, your ordered life rests on a prior violence you did not witness and could not have survived. Honestly, I think that is one reason the poem remained powerful for so long. Empires love stories in which order is not a pleasant accident, but a hard-won structure continuously maintained. Babylon in particular would hear itself inside Marduk's work. The city governed rivers. It imposed law. It measured grain. It tracked stars. It believed civilization meant the successful management of dangerous forces, floodwater, enemy kings, rebellious populations, disease, scarcity, divine mood. Marduk, building the cosmos from Tiamat, is Babylon dreaming its own task into the shape of the universe. Yet the poem never lets the older deep vanish entirely. The world made from Tiamat still remembers Tiamat. Sea remains dangerous. Chaos can still rise in storms, floods, rebellion, plague, and cosmic threat. The fact that order was fashioned from defeated chaos does not mean chaos has ceased to exist. It means it has been bounded, named, distributed, and temporarily held within a system of divine rule. That is a wiser and darker view than simple triumph. It means the universe is stable, but stability is an achievement, not a default. Marduk continues the work. He stations the moon. He appoints the year. He sets constellations in their courses. He gives the gods their places. In every action you can feel the cooling after battle, the immense exhale of a cosmos moving from danger into articulated form. A roof above, a floor below, lights assigned, paths fixed, limits declared. If the earlier parts moved like water, this part begins moving like architecture. You can imagine the first star taking its station, the first curve of the moon becoming meaningful, the first invisible boundary where the upper waters must stop and not crash back down. These are not small details. They are the conditions of every future calendar, every night watch, every omen text, every planting schedule, every royal ritual tied to heavenly timing. Marduk's victory becomes the reason ordinary life can later trust recurrence. And still the story is not finished. A structured cosmos is not yet a populated cosmos. There are gods to relieve, labor to distribute, cities to imagine, temples to build in time to come. But before any of that, the myth asks us to sit with the image of a world newly made from division. Heaven and earth separated, light placed, movement regulated, violence transmuted into order, the body of the enemy stretched into the very possibility of dwelling. That is where this movement rests, not in the shout of battle, but in the quiet that follows exact work. The storm has done more than kill. It is built. The sea has done more than resist. It has become world. And Marduk, standing in the still raw architecture of creation, has not only won kingship, he has made the first conditions under which anyone, divine or human, will ever again be able to call anything home. The world now has shape, but it does not yet have service. Heaven is stretched above. Earth is laid below. The stars have their stations. The moon has its measured path. The upper waters are held back. Time has begun to acquire rhythm. But a structured cosmos is not a restful cosmos. The gods themselves still labor. The temples of the future are not yet filled. The rituals of the coming cities are not yet spoken. And in the old Mesopotamian imagination, order is never complete until someone is assigned to maintain it. That is where the story turns toward humanity, and it does so with a frankness that still feels almost startling. We are not introduced as the beloved center of creation. We are not the first desire of the divine heart. We arrive because work remains. The gods need relief. The cosmos that Marduk has forced into shape requires tending, feeding, honoring, and repeating in ritual. Creation in this story is magnificent. Yes, but it is also administrative. Once the great structure stands, someone must sweep its courts, bring offerings, dye its channels, mark its festivals, and carry its memory forward in clay and blood and breath. There is something darkly soothing about that honesty. The old poem does not flatter us. It gives us function before dignity, labor before poetry. And yet, even that function carries a kind of gravity. To be made for maintenance is not nothing. Maintenance is what keeps collapse from returning. If Marduk won the world through battle, then humanity is asked to keep the world from slipping back toward the conditions that existed before his victory. That is a high burden, even if it is not described in tender language. The process begins with another act of divine decision. The great gods speak, assess, and conclude that one life must be taken so that another order of life can begin. The choice falls upon Kingu, the one who had held the tablets of destiny under Tiamat's appointment. His guilt in the story is political as much as moral. He bore the authorization of the rival cosmos. He represented chaos wearing the seal of legitimacy. Now that seal has been taken from him, and his own body becomes raw material for something new. This is where the story once again refuses the later comfort of pure creation by word alone. Blood is involved. Clay is involved. Death is involved. Humanity does not emerge untouched by conflict. We are shaped from the remains of rebellion and the common substance of the earth. If you were sitting in a Babylonian temple school, hearing these lines recited for the first time, you would understand at once that human nature is mixed. We belong partly to dust, partly to divine aftermath. We are earthly, but not simple. We are useful, but not neutral. Something troubled is in us from the start. Picture the making slowly. A veshel. Wet clay taken up in careful hands. The smell of riverbank mud, rich and mineral, the same matter from which bricks will later be pressed. Tablets formed, walls raised, seals impressed. Then blood, dark and potent, entering that clay. Not spilled wildly, but used, mixed, folded. The hand that works it knows what it is doing. The first human shape is not blown free in an instant. It is worked from substance, the way a skilled artisan coaxes form from material that does not yet know what it is supposed to become. I have always found that image deeply memorable. Clay and blood, earth and consequence, mud from the river plain and the life of a defeated divine rival joined into something that will speak. Sweat, Pray, build, grieve, and remember, no later compliment to humanity can quite erase how severe our origin is in this myth. We are made because the gods are tired. We are made from matter that has already passed through violence. And yet once made, we become essential. The cosmos Marduk has organized cannot proceed properly without us. That paradox gives this section of the poem its emotional weight. Humans are not adored in advance, yet we become the keepers of continuity. The gods offload labor, yes, but by doing so, they also create the beings through whom temples will receive incense. Names will be preserved. Fields will be watered. Kings will claim legitimacy. And the story of creation itself will survive. In a strange way, the poem lowers us and raises us in the same breath. The old Mesopotamian city would have understood this intuitively. Civilization is built on service. Grain does not store itself. Shrines do not clean themselves. Reed roofs do not repair themselves. Canal mud does not dredge itself from water channels. A field neglected for one season already begins to lean toward disorder. A city neglected for several becomes a mound. To be human in such a world is to know that labor is not merely punishment. It is the thin line between life and reversion. The poem gives that fact cosmic scale. Humans do for the gods what farmers do for a field and priests do for a shrine. We preserve conditions against entropy. Imagine the first humans opening their eyes into this newly measured world. Above them, a sky already assigned and divided. Around them, raw earth waiting for wall, canal, path, and altar. Within them, the strange inheritance of blood and clay, obedience and awareness. The first wind on the skin. The first pressure of standing weight. The first awareness of distance between one body and another. They are not animals in this vision. They are workers of order. They are made with enough intelligence to remember instructions, enough endurance to carry burden, enough speech to recite and name. The gods do not create mindless hands. They create ritual-capable hands. This matters because the next stage is not private existence, but civilization. Human beings are not made simply to breathe and wander. They are made to enter systems. Temples, cities, irrigation networks, administrative orders. The whole Mesopotamian world is implied inside their making. One can almost feel the future pressing forward the moment clay takes living form. Brick kilns not yet fired, but coming. Temple terraces not yet raised, but coming. Market noise, tax lists, court judgments, granary seals, marriage contracts, hymns, laments, lullabies. All of it somehow sleeping inside the first breath of these laboring creatures. And because this is still the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian imperial poem as much as a creation myth, the making of humanity naturally opens toward Babylon itself. Marduk has not secured supremacy merely to remain an abstract cosmic victor. His city must become the earthly mirror of his rule. Babylon will be the place where heaven's order takes urban form. Its temple will stand as the point of contact between the structured sky and the structured state below. Its rituals will restage the logic of creation itself. Humanity, then, is made not only for generic labor, but for the maintenance of sacred centralization. You can see why this would have mattered politically. A city that can say the whole cosmos was organized under its patron god gains more than prestige. It gains inevitability. Babylon, in this story, is not simply one city among others. It becomes the lit stage on which the victory over chaos is remembered, renewed, and made socially visible. Every offering, every procession, every recited line in the temple says the same thing. Order did not happen by accident. It was won. It must now be served. The Etmonanki and Ezagila rise in the imagination here, even if later stone and brick would give them specific monumental form. Think of the ziggurat not first as a building, but as a gesture. Earth lifted toward heaven by measured stages. Mud turned into height. A city declaring that human labor can create a meeting point between the divine arrangement above and the fragile political life below. In a world made from Tiamat's divided body, architecture itself becomes theology. The temple says what the poem says in another language. Chaos has been cut into forms. Forms can now be maintained. If you were walking at dawn through such a city in the old imagination, you would smell wet clay, smoke from morning fires, dung, vo, river water, brewing grain, and incense beginning its thin ascent from a court already being swept. Human hands everywhere, opening shutters, carrying jars, counting loaves, repairing baskets, marking deliveries, leading animals, mixing mortar. The poem's harsh account of human origins suddenly becomes almost tender when set against that scene. Not because the burden is light, but because the burden creates the world people actually live inside. And still the old severity remains. Humanity is made from the blood of one who stood on the wrong side of cosmic war. The implication is difficult to avoid. There is rebelliousness in us, instability in us, a trace of the rival order in the very creatures tasked with preserving the victorious one. Maybe that is why human civilization always needs ritual renewal. Maybe that is why cities decay so easily. Kings become arrogant so quickly, and violence returns even after great victories. The poem does not say this bluntly, but it hovers in the background like heat over stone. We are made to serve order, but we are not pure order ourselves. Honestly, that feels psychologically true in a way many gentler origin stories do not. Human beings do build, pray, measure, and remember. We also strain against duty, forget our limits, and carry conflict into the very structures meant to contain it. The Enuma Elish gives that contradiction an origin at the first moment of our making. Clay from earth below, blood from celestial rebellion. We are useful because we can think. We are dangerous because we can think. By the time this movement closes, the newly structured cosmos no longer feels empty. It feels occupied in potential by future cities and their workers. Marduk's triumph has become a social world. The battle against Tiamat has led not only to stars and sky, but to walls, shrines, lavor, and memory. Humanity enters not as crown, but as keeper, not as untouched innocence, but as material equal to a difficult task. And there is one more quiet implication in all this that I do not want to rush past. Because humans are made for service, they are also made for repetition. We wake, tend, carry, count, offer, repair, and begin again. In another kind of story that might sound bleak, here it sounds almost sacred. Repetition is how fragile order survives. The canal must be cleared again. The altar must be cleaned again. The harvest must be measured again. The hymn must be spoken again. The city does not endure by one grand heroic act, but by innumerable smaller acts of faithful continuation. In that sense, humanity is not the afterthought of creation. Humanity is the mechanism by which creation is kept from slipping back into neglect. So let the scene rest there for a moment longer. The first worker breathing in a new world. The first handful of mud drying on living skin. The first awareness that the earth is not simply a place to stand, but a task to be maintained. Somewhere above, Marduk's measured sky keeps its courses. Somewhere below, the old depths still remember what came before. And between them now moves a new creature, made from clay and consequence, burdened, useful, restless, and necessary. Once humanity has been made, the story could stop. A later tradition often would have let it stop. The sky is arranged. The earth is fixed. Humans are formed. The gods are relieved of labor, and the structure of the cosmos appears complete. But the Babylonian imagination was too politically alert and too ritual-minded to leave creation at the level of once upon a time. A world built through conflict does not remain ordered by accident. It has to be restated, reenacted, confirmed in public, especially when kings rule. Fields fail, enemies gather, and memory itself begins to drift. That is why the story moves naturally toward ritual. The cosmos must be renewed, not only admired. This is where Akitu enters, the great New Year festival of Babylon, and with it, one of the most fascinating turns in all ancient religion. Creation becomes ceremony. Myth becomes statecraft. The victory of Marduk over Tiamat is no longer only a tale about the first age of the world. It becomes something the city performs so that the world may continue to remain itself for one more year. If you had arrived in Babylon during Akitu, you would have felt the difference before anyone explained it. The city would carry a tension different from ordinary festival joy. This is not merely entertainment, not merely a holiday in the soft modern sense. It is sacred maintenance at the scale of a civilization that believes the boundary between order and chaos must be refreshed. Priests move with increased precision. Processions prepare. Statues are handled with extraordinary care. Routes are watched. Words are recited in exact sequence. Even the king, whose earthly authority might appear absolute on ordinary days, enters the ritual, knowing he is about to be humbled before the God whose triumph made kingship possible in the first place. That detail matters immensely. The king of Babylon does not simply sponsor Akitu. He is measured by it. At one crucial point, he is stripped of royal insignia before Marduk's high priest. He is slapped. He is made to kneel. He must declare that he has not neglected the god, the city, or the people. Tears are expected. Tears matter. If they come, it is taken as a sign that Marduk still favors the order of the kingdom. Imagine that scene in slow candlelight. A ruler accustomed to command standing without his ornaments, suddenly small before ritual, older than his reign. In that moment, the whole political theology of Babylon becomes visible. Human rule remains real, but only as a lease under divine order. I have always found that scene extraordinary because it shows how deeply the Babylonians linked cosmic structure to civic honesty. The king cannot simply wear power. He must periodically be broken back into proportion. Akitu reminds him that before there was Babylon, before there were dynasties and walls and markets, there was Tiamat. And before he can claim to preserve order, he must acknowledge the source from which order had to be rescued. The festival itself unfolds across days. Recitations of the Enuma Elish, processions through the city, statues of gods brought from their temples, sacred movement between central sanctuary and festival house outside the city walls. The whole route matters. Streets become ritual arteries. Architecture participates. Gates, courtyards, thresholds, open spaces between buildings. All of them begin to feel like parts of a cosmic machine. Babylon in Akitu is not simply celebrating myth. It is becoming the map of myth. Picture the city at dawn during those days. Reed mats damp with morning cool. Stone and brick holding last night's darkness. White garments brightening as the light climbs. Priests carrying vessels. Musicians waiting with still hands. Incense rising in a fine line before the wind catches it. The distant river breathing against embankments. And above everything, the sense that ordinary time has been suspended for a while, so older time can move through the streets again. That older time is the time of crisis, the time before victory. The time when Tiamat still threatened to swallow the future and Marduk had not yet secured the right to rule. Akitu does not hide that danger. It recalls it deliberately. That is why the festival is so psychologically sophisticated. Renewal only means something if people remember what disorder feels like. A world without danger does not need annual restaging. A world that knows how close it remains to collapse needs the memory of rescue, repeated until it becomes civic instinct. This also explains why the Enuma Elish matters far beyond its own lines. It is not merely a myth about beginnings. It is a script for governance. It teaches that authority must be earned through protection against chaos. That kingship is legitimate only when tied to a higher order. That human labor belongs inside sacred structure. That ritual repetition is not superstition but preventative architecture for time itself. Once you understand that, later traditions begin to look different. Genesis, for example, becomes more interesting, not less. The Old Hebrew account does not copy the Enuma Elish line by line. Of course, it reframes. It simplifies certain elements. It changes the theology profoundly. Yet once you have lived for a while inside the older Babylonian world, you can feel the echoes. Waters before ordered creation, a deep over which divine power moves, a sequence of structured acts producing a habitable world, humanity formed from earth, sacred time embedded in creation itself. The differences are real, but so is the inheritance. Genesis sounds quieter in some ways because it speaks after a world in which cosmic conflict had already been imagined so vividly. That is why the title you chose works so well. What story lived before Genesis was written? This one did. Not as a simple first draft, because history is never that tidy, but as an older and darker grammar for thinking about beginnings. Before creation could be imagined as sovereign command, it was imagined here as generational tension, divine succession, violence against primordial waters, and the carving of structure from a defeated chaos body. Genesis speaks with a different voice, but it is speaking into an atmosphere already shaped by stories like this. And the inheritance does not stop there. Later Jewish apocalyptic traditions, Greek reflections on primordial struggle, Gnostic theories of broken creation, even medieval and Renaissance attempts to reconcile chaos, matter, and divine order all move in a world where Mesopotamian questions still linger, even when the speakers no longer know exactly whose questions they were. Does order emerge peacefully or through contest? Is matter good, dangerous, or both? Why must power legitimate itself repeatedly? What is humanity for inside a structured cosmos? The Enuma Elish asked these in a Babylonian register, but they did not remain Babylon's alone. Even in modern scholarship, even in museum halls and lecture rooms, the poem keeps unsettling neat assumptions. We like to imagine intellectual progress as a smooth, brightening, but old texts like this remind us that some of the deepest questions about order and violence were confronted very early, and confronted with unnerving clarity. The Babylonians knew that every stable world tells a story about what it overcame. They knew political order and cosmic order reinforce one another. They knew ritual is often less about comforting individuals than about preserving systems. They knew a city without memory becomes fragile faster than it realizes. Honestly, that may be why the Enuma Elish still feels so alive. Not because we literally inhabit Marduk's cosmos in the way ancient priests claimed, but because we still live in ordered systems that must defend themselves against disorder, justify their authority, stage their legitimacy, and repeat foundational narratives so the center holds. Change the names, and much of the logic remains disturbingly familiar. There is also a softer afterglow to the poem that can be missed if one focuses only on the battle. Once Marduk wins, once humans are made, once Akitu renews the old victory each year, the world becomes livable. Measured days become possible. Festivals become possible. Records can be kept. Children can be raised under a sky whose motions mean something. Fields can be planted according to calendar instead of panic. That is no small gift. Even if the origin of order is violent, the result is still shelter. The poem never apologizes for its severity, but it understands why severity might be endured if it yields a world where cities stand and seasons return. So imagine Babylon at the close of Akitu. Processions easing, dust settling slowly on stones that have borne sacred feet. The king restored to his regalia, but perhaps wearing it with a slightly altered gravity. Priests returning texts to guarded rooms. The great city exhaling after days of heightened ritual pressure. Somewhere a scribe copies another line. Somewhere a family returns home through a gate that, for a little while, had felt like the opening between myth and street. Somewhere a child hears the name Tiamat and pictures only darkness and water, and something too large to understand. Somewhere an elder hears Marduk's name and feels again the relief that order has, at least for now, been reconfirmed. And far in the future, much farther than any Babylonian watching those rites could have guessed, another people will tell of creation through different words. And later, still others will read both stories under electric light and wonder how deep the inheritance goes. The answer is deeper than direct borrowing and broader than neat comparison. The old poem left behind more than motifs. It left behind a way of thinking. That beginnings may be conflict. That order may require repetition. That human beings may be both servants of structure and bearers of unrest. That sacred stories do not merely explain the world. They keep it from becoming unintelligible. That is the last calm place of this story. Not the first waters, not the arrow in battle, not even the shaping of heaven and earth from Tiamat's body, but the city after the recitation, when myth has passed back into ritual, ritual into politics, politics into daily life, and daily life into the patient work of memory. The Enuma Elish survives because it was never only about the first dawn. It was about every new year after, every year in which Babylon needed to tell itself again that chaos had been measured, that the sky still held, that kingship remained answerable, that human labor still mattered, and that the world, for one more cycle, would continue in order. And if you listen closely at the end of that ritual year, when the recitation is done and the city returns to its ordinary breathing, you can almost hear what the poem has been teaching all along. Creation was not the end of the struggle. It was the first successful arrangement against disorder. Every wall repaired, every law pronounced, every canal dredged, every offering lifted, every calendar marked. All of it belongs to the same long answer. Tiamat was defeated once in myth, but chaos in practice must be answered daily. That is the true afterlife of the Enuma Elish, not just in texts that came later, but in the lived discipline of civilization itself. So the older story remains beneath the later ones like water beneath brick, hidden sometimes, covered, built over by other voices, other scriptures, other empires, other prayers, yet still there, cooling the foundations. And when we return to it now, quietly, in this late hour, we do not only recover an old myth, we recover an ancient understanding that order is made, not assumed, renewed, not guaranteed, and remembered, not automatic. That may be the oldest wisdom the poem leaves us with, and perhaps the gentlest. Night settles differently after the festival. The streets are quieter now, though not empty. A city never truly empties, not one with ovens cooling, animals shifting in courtyards, watchmen trading, murmured reports at gates, and late workers carrying baskets through alleys where the dust has not yet given up the day's heat. But the heightened tension of Akitu has eased. The processions are over. The king has been struck and restored. The priests have recited the old lines. Marduk has once again defeated the deep in public memory. And still, even in that calmer air, the deeper question remains. What happens to a story like this after the city that shaped it begins to fade? That is where the final movement of the Enuma Elish becomes especially haunting. Not on the tablets themselves, but in the long shadow they cast beyond Babylon. A powerful myth never stays politely inside its original walls. It travels, changes clothes, loses a few names, acquires others, grows more severe in one place, softer in another, and keeps breathing underneath later worlds that may not even realize what they inherited. The old story of waters, conflict, ardor, human service, sacred kingship, and the yearly defense of civilization does not vanish when one empire declines. It becomes part of the mental ground on which other creation stories stand. If you were sitting in exile centuries later, somewhere far from the first courts where Marduk's name was spoken with imperial confidence, you might still hear echoes of the old arrangement without wanting to admit it. Waters before ordered creation. A deep that exists before the world is shaped. Earth emerging through division and structure. Humanity made from earth substance. Time measured through sacred pattern. These things do not belong only to one text, and yet the Babylonian version remains one of the earliest and most fully articulated expressions of them. That is why later comparisons with Genesis feel so inevitable. The comparison is often handled too crudely. Either people say Genesis simply copied everything, which is lazy, or they insist the resemblance means nothing at all, which is also lazy, only in a more polite coat. The truth is richer, slower, and more interesting. Genesis speaks in a different theological voice. Its God is not one divine actor among many. There is no rival Mother Sea who must be fought in open combat. There is no bargaining for kingship among a frightened assembly. There is no monster army, no Kingu, no public festival in which the city restages a divine war to keep time itself intact. And yet the older atmosphere remains in the room. The deep is there. The ordered sequence is there. The movement from formlessness to structure is there. The shaping of a habitable world from prior watery reality is there. I have always found that connection strangely intimate. It is like hearing two generations of a family tell the same inherited memory in radically different tones. One tells it with old fear still in the body. The other tells it after centuries of reflection, simplification, and sharper monotheistic insistence. The earlier version is louder, rougher, more political, more openly violent. The later version is cleaner in sound, but it has not emerged from nowhere. It is speaking after the old waters have already been imagined. The old Mesopotamian listener and the later Hebrew listener are not standing in the same intellectual room, but they are not strangers either. Both know what it means to live where water can save and destroy. Both know cities are fragile. Both know order must somehow be linked to divine will. Both know human life takes place inside arrangements larger than kings can finally control. When Genesis says the Spirit moves over the face of the waters, anyone who knows the older traditions feels the quiet difference and the quiet kinship at once. This God does not struggle like Marduk, but the waters still stand there, ancient and waiting. And perhaps that is the most enduring part of the Babylonian inheritance. Not the names alone, but the seriousness with which beginnings are treated. The Enuma Elish does not imagine the world as a casual act. It imagines creation as the answer to a crisis. Later traditions transform that idea, but many do not fully abandon it. Even where chaos is no longer personified as Tiamat, the memory remains. That order is meaningful because it answers something deeper and more dangerous than mere emptiness. As the centuries move on, Greek thinkers inherit fragments of Near Eastern cosmological habits, even when they recast them into philosophy or poetry. Hellenistic readers merge, translate, compare, and argue. Gnostic writers later become fascinated by flawed creation, layered heavens, and the strange tension between divine reality and the material world. They are no longer telling Marduk's story, not directly, but the old Babylonian willingness to ask whether the world is built through conflict rather than serene simplicity still flickers in the background. Then, later still, in late antiquity in the medieval world, scholars, priests, and commentators keep working over the problem in their own vocabularies. Is matter passive or resistant? Is creation command or arrangement? Is time sacred because it repeats a first divine act, or because it proceeds away from it? How should kingship be humbled under heaven? What is humanity for? Worship, labor, stewardship, obedience, memory. The Enuma Elish had already placed all those pressures into one dramatic architecture. And once such an architecture exists, later minds can renovate it, deny it, purify it, or argue with it, but they rarely escape it completely. And there is something slightly funny about that. In a dry, ancient way, Babylon, like every imperial center, probably imagined itself as the middle of the world and the final keeper of real order. History, being history, smiled its patient little smile and carried Babylon's ideas far beyond Babylon itself, often without the empire that coined them, receiving much credit in the later retellings. That is almost the oldest joke in civilization. The builders of great systems imagine permanence. Their walls fall. Their words keep walking. But words do not walk alone. Clay walks with them in its own stubborn way. Museums now hold fragments of the old poem, broken tablets, missing lines, edges worn by burial, fire, accident, and time. A modern reader standing before one of those tablets might at first feel only distance. Wedge marks, brown surface, a label, glass, controlled light, the usual museum hush. Then the translation begins to work inward. Water before the world, divine conflict, creation from division, humanity made for service, the New Year recitation. Suddenly the fragment feels less dead than the room around it. If you were standing there with me, I think you would notice the same odd sensation I always do in front of ancient tablets. They feel small, almost disappointingly small at first. A whole world on something not much larger than a household object. And yet maybe that is the right scale after all. Civilization survives in things that can be carried, copied, stacked, hidden, buried, found again. The Enuma Elish crossed centuries, not because it was huge, but because it was writable. That thought calms me more than I can quite explain. For all the darkness in the poem, the final medium is patient clay, hands pressing signs, one line after another. Someone in Babylon leaning over a damp tablet, copying the first words. When on high, someone else, centuries later, copying them again. Someone much later reading the broken result under a different sky. Myth becomes transmission. Transmission becomes survival. Survival becomes the strange afterlife in which we are speaking of it now at all. And that is where the story starts to feel less like ancient spectacle and more like inheritance. Not because we all secretly believe Marduk cut the sky from Tiamat's body in literal historical time, but because we still live among questions he was asked to answer. What must order overcome? What does authority owe the world it governs? What is human labor for? Why does every year seem to require renewal? Why do old fears return under new names? The poem remains alive because the civilization it describes is gone, but the structure of concern is not. As this movement settles, let the grand scenes recede for a moment. No battle now, no storm chariot, no processional road. Just a lamp in a late room, a tablet on a stand, a reader tracing translated lines with the mind more than the eye. Outside, a modern city with its own traffic, its own official speeches, its own calendars, its own claims to order. Inside, an old Babylonian poem whispering that worlds are made, maintained, threatened, renewed, and never quite finished. That is not only ancient theology, it is also a remarkably enduring description of civilized life. So the long afterlife of Enuma Elish is not merely that later texts resemble it here and there, though they do. It is that the poem helped define a way of thinking in which beginnings matter because they continue to explain maintenance, ritual, law, kingship, and human duty long after the first dawn has passed. Creation is not just origin. It is precedent. Every later structure looks back, knowingly or not, towards some first arrangement and asks whether it still holds. The old Babylonian answer was severe, but clear. It holds if it is renewed. It holds if memory is preserved. It holds if kings know they are smaller than the order they represent. It holds if labor continues. It holds if ritual does not let the city forget the shape of danger. It holds if the story is recited again. That may be the deepest reason the poem endured through collapse, conquest, translation, and academic recovery. It never thought one victory was enough. It knew forgetting was half of chaos. So it kept speaking, through tablets, through festivals, through echoes in later scripture, through the thin, persistent line between one civilization's ending and another one's beginning. And now, almost at the edge of the final quiet, we return to what has been there from the first lines, water, clay, breath, and the human need to place ourselves inside a story large enough to explain why the world is beautiful, dangerous, and somehow still habitable. In the next and last movement, we leave the empire, and even the comparison, behind. We go back to the first, deep, and to the question the poem still leaves in our hands, when every god has taken his seat and every ritual has ended. What does it mean to live in a world built from chaos, and to keep tending it anyway? There is one final thread to notice before we let this part end. The Babylonian poem does not survive because it won some tidy literary contest against later scripture. It survives because it names a human condition that is older than any one canon. We inherit cities we did not found, calendars we did not design, laws we did not first imagine, and stories that were already ancient before our own languages learned how to pronounce them. The Enuma Elish knows this. It knows every generation comes late into a world already arranged by others, and must decide whether to honor, revise, or neglect what it has received. That question belongs as much to scribes and priests as to modern readers leaning over a translation at midnight. So when the old Babylonian account lingers under later tradition, it does more than provide background. It keeps asking whether any culture can truly begin from scratch. The answer, I think, is no. Every beginning rests on another beginning. Every sacred text emerges into an atmosphere already thick with older metaphors, older fears, older images of water and order and breath. Even when a later tradition rejects the older gods, it often continues talking with their shadows. By the end of the story, the room feels quieter than it did at the beginning. That always happens when an old myth has done its work properly. It does not leave you louder. It leaves you more attentive. The fire sounds different. The air in the room feels more layered. Even a glass of water on the table can begin to look like a memory from the first age of things. That is one of the gifts of the Enuma Elish. It returns ordinary substances to strangeness. Water becomes older than language. Clay becomes the body of service. Time becomes something measured because someone once fought for the right to arrange it. And once all the great names have been spoken, Apsu, Tiamat, eerie, Marduk, Kingu, once the stars have been set, humanity formed, Babylon exalted, Akatu completed, and the long shadow toward Genesis and later traditions has been traced. What remains is not simply information. What remains is a mood, and perhaps a discipline. The poem asks us to live with a difficult truth. That order is precious precisely because it is not automatic. I think that is why this ancient story can become so soothing when told slowly. Not because it is gentle and content. It is not. It contains fear, rivalry, violence, and the hard fact that the world of cities and calendars and offerings arose from something much more unstable than those who inherit it usually like to admit. But there is calm in clarity. The Babylonians did not flatter themselves with the idea that civilization was natural and effortless. They knew it was built. They knew it had to be tended. They knew every wall, every law, every ritual, every kingly claim, every measured day stood against a deeper possibility of disorder. In naming that, they made life feel more fragile. Yes, but also more meaningful. The older I get, the more I think fragility is what gives order its beauty. A thing that could never fail is difficult to love. It is too abstract, too automatic, too much like a machine humming in another room. But a canal that must be dredged again, a temple floor that must be swept before dawn, a calendar that must be corrected, a kingdom that must humble itself once a year before the God it serves. Those things carry tenderness because they require care. The Enuma Elish, for all it grandeur, is finally a poem about care after conflict. Marduk does not merely win, he arranges. Humanity does not merely exist, it maintains. Babylon does not merely boast, it reenacts. The whole civilization described by the poem understands itself as an ongoing answer. That answer can be political, ritual, practical, even architectural, but it is always being given again. I find that almost moving. The world is not saved once. It is steadied repeatedly. Maybe that is why the image of clay stays with me more than the image of battle. The battle is magnificent. Yes. Storm, net, arrow, sea split into sky and earth. All of it unforgettable. But clay feels closer, more honest. Clay is what you carry under fingernails after work. It is what dries on the heel after walking near the river. It is what becomes tablet, brick, bowl, seal, offering stand, drain, wall, and home. In this story, it also becomes us. There is no cleaner reminder that human life belongs to labor and memory than that old image of blood and clay folded together by divine hands. If you were standing in ancient Babylon at dusk, after the last light had gone red over the river and the upper terraces had begun to lose their edges, you might hear the city in layers. A jar being set down, a gate shut, a child still speaking when sleep should already have taken hold, someone coughing in an upper room, sandals on packed earth, dogs somewhere farther off than they sound, a temple singer practicing one phrase again because one phrase matters. All of it so ordinary, all of it possible because the people there believed the world had been measured into habitability and could continue only if habit was honored. There is wisdom in that, even for us now. Not the imperial confidence, perhaps. Not the theology in its original political form, but the deeper wisdom, certainly. The recognition that every stable world depends on acts of renewal too small to be noticed when they succeed. The road kept clear, the law remembered, the field watered, the text copied, the truth repeated before it is forgotten. Chaos in the Enuma Elish is dramatic because drama helps memory, but most of the answer to chaos is humble. It looks like maintenance. And that thought leads us gently back to Genesis one last time, and beyond Genesis too. Later, traditions often place more emphasis on moral innocence, on divine sovereignty, without visible struggle, on the elegance of command. Those are real theological shifts. Yet even where the older combat has faded, the need for maintenance remains. Sabbath, prayer, liturgy, sacrifice, law, scripture, repentance, festival, fasting, all later traditions, in one form or another, retain the sense that human beings must participate in the ongoing shape of order. The old Babylonian poem says this in one accent. Later texts say it in others. But the human problem remains recognizably the same. How do you keep a world inhabitable? That is such a simple question on the surface. Almost domestic. Yet inside it are politics, theology, climate, memory, ethics, labor, end time. The Enuma Elish answered with divine kingship and sacred city ritual. Another culture answered with covenant. Another with philosophy. Another with empire. Another with science and law. None of them escaped the question. That is why the oldest myths remain near us. They ask first what we are still asking last. There is also a quiet mercy in how the poem ends its work on the mind. After all the rivalry and pressure, it leaves us not inside the battle, but inside a world that has held. The stars are up there. The moon has its path. The upper waters remain above. The earth remains below. Cities rise. Fields are planted. Festivals return. Even if one does not share the theology, one can still feel the relief. Form exists. Mourning can be expected. That expectation alone is one of the greatest luxuries a civilization ever earns. I suppose that is why people kept copying this poem, not only because it glorified Babylon, not only because it supported Marduk's status, not only because priests needed it for ritual. They kept copying it because it gave shape to a fear every urban people knows and to a hope every urban people depends on. The fear that the world can slide backward, the hope that it can be steadied again. There is a little humor in that too, though ancient humor, dry as dust. Human beings are made from clay and rebellious blood, charged with preserving order in a world they did not make, under gods whose politics are more complicated than most royal courts. And somehow they are expected to keep canals clear and festivals on schedule. It is such an impossible job that it circles back around to dignity. Perhaps that is one reason the Babylonians kept so many records. If the task is absurdly large, one at least makes a list. And we are still making lists. Inventories, archives, timetables, constitution, prayer books, maintenance requests, school calendars, water reports, census forms, all the descendants of the same old need to hold shape against drift, to remember what must be done next, to keep the world from fraying at its edges. The Enuma Elish would understand that impulse immediately. So now the old story settles. The primordial waters no longer rage. They rest in memory. Apsu remains as the hidden sweet deep below things. Tiamat remains as the reminder that what nourishes can also overwhelm, and that every ordered world is built from some prior undivided vastness. Ea remains the bright cunning that saves a future by daring to alter the past. Marduk remains the image of force transformed into architecture. Kingu remains the troubling blood inside human usefulness. Babylon remains the city that dared to stage the cosmos in its own streets. And we remain what the poem said we were in one of its hardest, strangest truths. Creatures made not for idle admiration of order, but for participation in it. That is where the calm comes from at the very end. Not from believing the world is safe. The Babylonians would never promise that. The calm comes from knowing that danger can be named, that memory can be preserved, that rituals and stories can keep a people from forgetting what the world costs, and that even a fragile order is still worth tending. Perhaps, especially then. The first lines gave us water before sky and land. The last feeling they leave us with is not terror, but reverence. Reverence for the fact that anything coherent exists at all. Reverence for the patient work that keeps it coherent. Reverence for the old tablets that survived long enough to tell us how one of the earliest civilizations understood the task. So let the room grow dimmer now. Let the fire sink lower. Let the day and all its bright modern noise drift a little farther away. Somewhere in the distance, beyond brick, beyond empire, beyond translation, beyond theology. The first waters still move in the imagination, dark and undivided. Above them, the measured lights still hold their stations. Between them stands humanity, made of clay, carrying memory. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. Not a final answer, just an old one, carefully preserved. The world was not given shape lightly. Keep that shape gently. Remember what lived beneath the later story. Remember the deep. Remember the hands in clay. Remember that order is a practice. And one more thing before sleep carries the rest of the night away. The poem also leaves us with humility toward the past. Modern people are often tempted to imagine ancient myths as crude attempts at explanation. Charming, perhaps, but childish. The Enuma Elish resists that. It is politically alert, ritually exact, psychologically sharp, and emotionally complex. It understands that power needs ceremony, that labor needs meaning, that fear needs form, and that memory must be renewed or it fades into noise. The more closely you listen, the more the poem starts to sound less like a relic and more like a voice from another room in the same house of human thought. The furniture is different. The gods are different. The legal vocabulary is different. But the pressure in the questions is familiar. Who authorizes order? What happens when systems fail? How do ordinary people live under arrangements too large for them to fully grasp? Why must rulers be humbled? Why must stories be retold? Why does every society fear the return of flood, famine, confusion, and forgetting? If you imagine the oldest scribe who copied these lines, bent over damp clay while daylight narrowed in some room of a temple school, he could not have known who would read them much later. Yet he copied anyway, carefully, wedge after wedge. There is something deeply human in that. To write because the world is fragile, to copy because forgetting is dangerous, to preserve because one day someone may need the old words again. So let the final image be simple. Not Marduk with bow drawn, not Tiamat split beneath the storm, not even Babylon in festival brilliance. Let it be a human hand touching clay while the night gathers outside, a lamp burning low. Water stored nearby in a jar. The first signs drying slowly into permanence. The world is still dangerous. The world is still beautiful. The work of keeping it legible goes on. Good night.